Hey guys, welcome to this week's podcast episode. I'm really excited about today's guest, William Wadsworth, coming in from the UK, and he's going to talk to us all about unlocking the brain's potential for learning. And how does this apply to the audience? Is that a lot of the audience, we're executives, professionals, we had to study, make good marks, make good grades, take our exams. And there's actually a skill set for learning, for memory, for retention, and for exam taking. So, which is why I brought him onto the show. He's got some really interesting techniques, and hopefully it'll be a benefit to the audience, their kids. And I'm happy to welcome him to the show. So, William, welcome.
Hey, Chris, it's great to be here. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah. So I know we were talking backstage, and you're asking, how can I add value? And so kind of set the stage, talk about your experience, your journey and learning, and how you're now helping other people to do the same.
Yeah. So my background is as a psychologist. So I read psychology at Cambridge University here in the UK. And then I went out into the corporate world and sort of climbed the corporate ladder for a bit. I was a senior strategy manager for Sky here in the UK, the big TV company. Now part of Comcast Group, who I'm sure is familiar to many of your stateside listeners. I just had a moment about 5 years or so ago when I'd had this itch ever since my kind of university days, where I really wanted to spread the word about more effective ways to learn. That had always been a passion of mine. And the kind of seed of that passion was actually when I was studying psychology. I remember having one lecture tucked away somewhere towards the end of my second year, I think it was. And this was a lecture about how learning works and how to get information to stick in memory. And the thing, my teenage years, Chris, I was a pretty conscientious student. I worked pretty hard, classic kind of overachiever. And, I had that lecture and I sat there and I listened to how the brain works and how we learn. And I just thought, well, this is crazy that I've been working my socks off all these years, all these exams I've taken at high school, university, and no one's told me actually how to do it, or the science behind what's going to help me do it in the most effective way. So that ultimately led to me doing what I do now and kind of running the Exam Study Expert podcast, reaching, hundreds of thousands of listeners around the world every year, and kind of private coaching and all the other things I do to support students and professionals taking exams to study smarter, not necessarily harder.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because through undergrad, I made it through by just rote memorization. I could just, figure out what was on the exam, do the homework, do the skill sets, and then medical school, I was like, man, I'm studying super hard. And then like my classmates, man, they studied like 1 hour and they were, acing the exam. So I was like, man, there's got to be hacks and, different ways of learning. It's not just, kind of rote memorization. It's kind of like it's like kind of beating a dead horse, but if you can find better ways. So, we'll start. The thing is, one thing is talking about is when these individuals that can, I'd heard of one story where he was in law school and all he did was party, and then all he could do was like study the night before and then ace the exams. How are students doing that? And, are they cheating, or are there tricks? Kind of share your insights.
So my kind of philosophy, I would never pretend to any of my, followers or clients that I can magic away the need to study. We still need to put in the work in exactly the same way that if I was a kind of a physical trainer, a professional in the world of kind of building a phenomenal body, no credible professional in that field would be sitting down and saying, you no longer need to work out. I've figured it out. You don't need to work out, guys. Good news. You can do it all the night before and turn up at the Olympics and win. It's not how it works in physical training. It's not how it works in mental training either. You still need to do the work. With the tools I teach, you may be able to get away with less work than you used to, particularly if you're, used to putting in a lot of time. You may be able to scale that back and reduce it. And you may also find that if you kind of keep your workouts similar, you can get a lot more done in that time. So your results go up. So you can get more done in less time, but it doesn't go all the way down to no time at all. What I do find though is that, so to kind of come back to your question and the example you gave of the student that never does any work, you do come across that from time to time, and at different levels of academia. What I tend to find is that we do all have a kind of slightly different natural aptitude, I think, for how quickly we pick things up. And there are many students I'll talk to through high school that don't put in a lot of work and just kind of get by on natural talent and being quite bright and brushing up the night before, and they kind of get away with it. It doesn't mean they're using best practice. And at some point for those individuals, because I'll see individuals at various points in their journey, like at some point things will stop working out quite so well for them. So, a very common conversation I'll have is when a student gets into university, and you mentioned you are a medical student yourself. That's a classic example. You might have got away with high school, not really breaking much of a sweat academically, just getting through it on kind of naturally being able to pick stuff up in lessons. And then you get to medical school and you're like, oh my gosh, and then it doesn't work for you anymore. And you have that kind of rude jolt and that rude awakening. And suddenly you're faced with, okay, how do I kind of put this together? What am I supposed to do? And some individuals navigate that, others don't. And that's, one of the reasons some people kind of don't stay the course and end up falling off the rails and dropping out. So, there's a few thoughts there for you. I hope that goes some way to addressing your question, Chris.
Yeah. And so, kind of, to add on to that is, I've had my, roommate in medical school, and, several roommates. And then one of them was like, he was like, for the exams, he was like, okay, once you figure out like there's certain topics and then there's certain like questions that they'll ask, and then he could sort of prepare himself. And so how do you, in your clients and your work, how do you help them design good study routines, design best study methods? You mentioned some tactics, and you don't have to spill the secret sauce, but kind of give audience a flavor of what you do in your work.
Let's build the foundations of the secret sauce, Chris. Let's dive right in. So, look, I think there's the first two things I'd want anyone to know about working effectively, which I think is essentially kind of what you're asking here, like what are the secrets to doing well in less time. And like when it comes to learning stuff and getting stuff to stick in memory effectively, now there's two bits of cognitive psychology that we really need to understand well and be able to apply well. So the first one of those is called retrieval practice. The second one is called spaced learning. And when we put these two ideas together, that is the secret formula. That is the code to get stuff to stick in memory. That is the basis of success. So what are these things? Just to unpack a little bit. The first one, retrieval practice, that simply means testing yourself, pulling knowledge out of memory, otherwise known as active recall. So if you've kind of looked on YouTube about sort of study advice, it's sometimes also called active recall. I'm a psychologist by background. In the psychology literature, we call it retrieval practice. So that's what I call it. It just means practice at retrieving what you know from your memory. People often say, well, sure, I test myself. Of course, I test myself as part of learning. But what a lot of people will kind of naturally do is they'll have the testing bit as kind of more like a diagnostic phase. So they'll do some learning in some other form, rereading, making notes, whatever it is. And then right at the end, they'll do some self-testing as like a check to see whether their learning has worked. And what we're saying with the principle of retrieval practice is, well, no, actually, what we want to be doing is making as much a part of the whole learning cycle, the whole learning process as possible, based on this pulling knowledge out of memory in some way, testing yourself. A little tidbit, even if you don't take exams, you've probably heard the advice, how do you remember someone's name? Like we all meet, professional context, you might meet, plenty of colleagues, clients, partners, how do you remember those names? That's a really great social and professional skill to have. The usual advice is, repeat their name back to them as soon as you hear it. And then again, a couple of, exchanges later, and then again at the end of the conversation. It's retrieval practice. And in that example, it's not only retrieval practice, you're not only practicing remembering their name, it's also spaced retrieval practice, which brings us on to that second part, the spaced learning bit. So we don't just want to do our retrieval once. If you only repeated their name straight back at them, it might stick, but, not always. For best results, we want to repeat that process of retrieving that name or whatever it is you're trying to learn from your memory. So do it multiple times with a time delay in between. In the same way that if you were doing a workout, you'd be going, lifting some weight, allowing a bit of time to recover, then going back the next day, lifting some weight again. So that combination of the testing and then repeating it over time intervals, that is at the heart of success in getting stuff to stick in memory.
Yeah, I love that. And, you implement these tactics and tricks in in your learning to become more efficient. The other thing that came to mind while you were talking is so for example, I talked to a lot of students, and the way they perceive learning is, so for example, you have your initial learning of the material, and then you have the exam, and then there's space between how you learn, it could be coaching, could be memorization, could be what you were talking about. And then a lot of the smartest ones, they basically find a way to condense from point A to point B. So instead of taking 2 hours, they take 30 minutes, and then they make it more efficient. They know shortcuts, and then they don't have to do all the steps. They can they can jump around. So in your opinion, is structured routine study versus kind of a free flowing, which one works better, or is it client dependent?
I mean, you mentioned routine, and I'll talk a little bit about routine. You also talked about shortcuts. So just to give you an example of a sort of shortcut that might speak to your point, like making notes is a common way that people study for tests, exams, and it doesn't involve any retrieval practice. When you're making notes, you've got the book open in front of you. You don't have to remember anything. So there's no retrieval practice happening. So what people will often do is they'll make their notes, and then maybe later on they'll either reread them, or maybe, if they know about retrieval practice, one of the ways to do retrieval practice is to do flashcards. They might convert their notes into flashcards. What I'd say is, well, if you're going to go to the trouble of making notes, let's make notes that you can test yourself on. So you skip a step effectively. Rather than having to make notes and then maybe turn them into flashcards, let's make notes that are set up to test yourself. So it's really simple. Just put a line down the page, put your content down that right-hand side, put little questions or cues down the left-hand side. Cover up the right-hand side, and then you can test yourself on those questions or cues. You're still making notes. You haven't really changed, you've tweaked your technique a little bit, but you've made it far more powerful, because now you can go back and test yourself on the notes you've made, and you don't have to go off and do some other strategy. So it sort of saves you time. At that point you were making about shortcutting your way to success. In terms of the routine, I'm a big fan of having routine for kind of my day. Like, I find that a very supportive thing, and many of the people I work with find the same thing. Like, I think what that helps prevent is that constant negotiating against yourself the whole day. A lot of students, scholars, or if you're studying for exams outside, alongside a day job, and you've got time before work or after work, you've got control over that time. No one's sitting there and making you do it. No one's making you punch in and out. It's on your time. It's on your terms. And that can be, it's a gift, but it's also a challenge because no one's checking up on us until that final test comes in, right? So routine is a really nice way to kind of avoid the kind of negotiating against yourself and kind of losing almost like mental energy units, just figuring out, okay, when am I going to do it this day? When am I going to fit it in? Okay, well, if I do it 15 minutes later, I'll finish 50, all that kind of mental overhead of just figuring it out day to day. Just kind of get rid of it all by systematizing your routine and having a plan for how you want each day to look. You might need theme and variations if your days vary, but as far as possible, trying to keep things broadly consistent, I think, is a really, really good plan in terms of when you do your study. Now, if you have kind of a regular pattern of classes, you might even build in kind of additional elements of structure as well. So you not only have your times laid out, but you also have kind of the tasks for each time slot. So one time slot will be the assignments for a certain class. Another time slot will be the kind of making your flashcards or whatever it is for another class. So that might be supportive as well. So yes, it does just depend a little bit on kind of the structure of your time and what your challenges are. But I think as a general idea, having routine, having structure is almost always a good plan.
Yeah. The other question is, so for example, like best times to study, and then also study times, because when I was in med school, it was basically just class, for the first 2 years. And you basically had, you could 24 hours if you could study, but then when we got into like clinics and residency where you're actively working, so at the end of the day, you just have no mental energy to study, and you may not be studying effectively. So how do you reconcile that?
Yeah. I mean, so I work with a lot of professionals who have a day job and they're studying outside their day job for exams, and the clinical professionals would be a great example in the world of medicine. So there's a couple of things. Firstly, thinking about before versus after work. So for a lot of people, they might find getting up that bit earlier, getting some work in before the workday is a great
Mhm.
thing rather than, you know, putting it in the evening when they get back from work and they're exhausted. So thinking about that as an option. Thinking about your space as well as the time is quite an important consideration. So, you might have home as your natural option.
Uh,
Maybe there's options to study at your workplace as well, either before work, after work, maybe during breaks, maybe during lunchtime. So that can be a good option. Some people, if your workplace is quite quiet, getting in early, getting your head down, quite easy to focus, that might be better than doing your work at home when there's all those, the TV's there and your, sofa's there and your fridge is there, all these kind of temptations, you don't have that so much in the workplace. So that might be more conducive to staying focused. So you've got the home, workplace, and then there's kind of this idea of the third space, as I call it. So if neither of those first two are good options for whatever reason, then sort of asking yourself, well, is there a third space option for me? So that might be a coffee shop on your commute, or it might be a local library that has opening hours that kind of fit in with your work patterns, particularly at weekends. So kind of experimenting with location as well as times of day, I think those are often the first two things to figure out as you're putting together your study routine.
Yeah, I love that. And it's basically how you best, one thing I learned is everybody learns differently and studies differently, and it's how you best structure to get the best outcome. And then kind of to follow up on that is you have, law school, med school, you've got all this volume of information. And how do you fit in just, that's a lot of work just to learn the material and keep up with it, but then you also have to review it for your exams. What are your
Yeah.
techniques and recommendations for reviewing old material before the exam?
Yeah. Ideally, the best case is when there's no distinction between the work you're doing day in, day out, and then the reviewing for the exam or the revising for the exam. The two processes, it's all part of the same thing. So some of the most successful students, I see, and I kind of do research on this as well, and kind of some of the, I'll do focus group work, and I'll ask students, there's a particular case where just like I'll look at students who have exceeded their expectations, the academic expectations upon them. They've punched above their weight, and one of the consistent findings when you look at those kinds of students is that they are doing exactly what I was just describing. They're not sort of leaving the review to the right at the end, like it's happening right throughout their course. So they're doing the kind of, if they've got particular set assignments or homework or whatever it is for their classes, they're doing that. But then they're also starting their review process just as part of going through the course. So for example, a good way to do your retrieval practice is flashcards or that sort of smart notes strategy with the two columns I mentioned. So you're kind of making those materials as you're going through your course. And maybe, you're making them, you're writing them, and then maybe you're saving some time at the end of the week. You're carving out some time to go through and test yourself on all the flashcards or all the smart notes, as I call them, that you've made that week.
Yeah.
So you're starting the learning process off. And then when you get to, the exam is coming, you don't have to go and kind of make all those materials. You've already got them ready to go. You've maybe done a round or two of testing on them already. So you're in a fantastic position then just to dive in, go straight into the testing, straight into the retrieval practice, straight into that really juicy, good memory workout stuff, and get yourself test ready. And then start to layer on, practice papers, do full kind of practice papers, if you've got access to some, and some of those other things to get yourself in the best shape to take that test. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
The next question I have is with this, how information is just so rapidly changing. So, stuff that we learned maybe a year ago is outdated. And so you did all that work to learn all that material information, and then something new comes. My thinking is, why learn that when it's going to change and, so quickly? So is it better just to kind of like a hit and run, just learn it really and just kind of superficial and then kind of keep up with it? Or is it like go deep? What are your thoughts?
And feel free to challenge me on this, but I think in most fields, it doesn't change so rapidly that there is complete turnover of like the entire knowledge base or theory base for a discipline, and it's completely different the following year. It might be like 3% different in a year for a given field. Even a field that's moving quite rapidly due to ongoing research in, some particular branch of medicine, a lot of new research, like in a year, like a 3% shift in what's the best practice year on year. That's quite a big shift. That's 3 in 10 bits of practice that have totally changed year on year. Three and 100 bits of practice that change every year. Like that's already feels like quite a dynamic field. But then most of it doesn't change. So, I'd say probably don't use that as an excuse for not knowing your stuff, and as I guess as a kind of reassurance. I think one of the things you notice, and this is just from my observation, kind of impressive individuals in different fields, be it business, medicine, law, whatever it is, are typically quite knowledgeable individuals. So you look at individuals that have gone very far in their field. I think it's a common trend that they tend to know a lot about their field, and that includes the history of their field. And that just adds a whole depth and quality to their professional judgments on certain issues. So they don't just have that superficial opinion of kind of, this is what we do today. They also have that weight of, well, actually, this is what we do today. And we used to think X, Y, Z, but now we know better. And therefore, you can think of lots of examples in given fields where that adds just a whole different dimension of gravitas to a given professional conversation.
Yeah. I love that. And so for all the audience out there, let's thank William for coming on. He's got top marks from in a first class degree from Cambridge. And so how can people contact you and reach out to you if they want to learn more, if their kids need help, if they need help with exams, how can they reach out to you?
Yeah. So, the first place, you're listening to a podcast. So I'd say if you want to check out more of, me and the things I teach, you might be interested in checking out the podcast, which is the Exam Study Expert podcast. It's pretty easily findable. We're in the, we're kind of pretty much the top podcast, certainly as I've been able to find on this subject of how to study smarter. So it pops up quite easily. So that's the podcast. If you're interested in taking the next step and potentially getting my help for your situation directly, maybe you've got exams coming up and you want a little bit of support, or as you were saying, your kids have got exams. I work with learners of all ages, as you probably picked up on the conversation. You head to examstudyexpert.com/coaching, and you can get in touch with me there and book a consultation. We'll have a bit of a chat, and then we can talk about how I might be best able to help you or your family. So yeah, those are the two places I suggest. Check out the podcast, and if you're interested in a little bit more help, head to examstudyexpert.com/coaching.
Yeah. And I really enjoyed this conversation. I love learning and the techniques and how you apply it in real world situations to get ahead, in your career. And with that, be sure to follow William's socials on all his media and give him a like and follow. And with that, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
It's been such a pleasure, Chris. Thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed talking.